Good day, everyone. I am Rhea Maris Labrador, and my partner is Kathleen Baclayon, and I will be reporting about examining North Korea's structural violence. So, first, what is structural violence? So, structural violence refers to situations where social structures sustain injustice and cause avoidable pain. It comprises cultural, political, symbolic, and everyday violence as well as other forms of violence like health, economic, gender, and racial inequities. This idea, which was first proposed by Johann Galtung, emphasizes how societal institutions such as the legal, political, medical, and economic systems disproportionately affect certain groups, leading to unfavorable outcomes including war, suicide, and homicide. Social injustice and structural violence are intimately related. Structural violence affects people differently within different social institutions and is directly associated with direct violence such as hate crimes, gender-based violence, and familial violence. It highlights the nuances of suffering and injustice, of the historical causes of contemporary inequalities, as well as the effects of sexism, racism, and economic inequality on people's perspective realities as opposed to their actual situations. So there were three examples of structural violence: denial of state resources for Dalit Christians and tribals in India, health treatment in South Africa, and the poverty in Philippines. So first, let's discuss the denial of state resources for Dalit Christians and tribals in India. So the denial of state resources for Dalit Christians and tribals in India is a form of structural violence in the religion perpetrated by anti-conversion laws. These laws discriminate against Christians, denying them the right to practice, propagate, and promote their religion. Dalit Christians and tribals face significant barriers to accessing resources and opportunities, making them vulnerable to these laws. This denial of resources and restrictions on religious conversion hinders their ability to meet their basic needs and reach their full potential. So, because of their religion, they were not able to access to their basic needs. So, next is the health treatment in South Africa. Adolescents and young people seeking sexual and reproductive health treatment in South Africa, primary healthcare facilities are victims of structural violence. The study emphasizes the need for a multi-sectoral approach that includes stigma reduction interventions and collaboration between healthcare workers, young people, families, and communities. It also highlights the role that structural violence plays in perpetuating negative sexual and reproductive health outcomes for this age cohort. In South Africa, discrimination, healthcare, education, and economic opportunities are a few areas where structural violence is present. So there's a situation in South Africa that only the high nobles and rich people are able to access the comfort of healthcare facilities, or which we call it as private hospitals, while the poor ones were sent to public hospital in which it lacks of medical needs. So next is the poverty in Philippines. So in the Philippines, structural violence is a pervasive across the system and procedures, regularly infringing upon a broad spectrum of Filipinos' human rights. As a type of structural violence, poverty has its roots in the political, social, and cultural structures of the Philippines. It is ingrained in the system and consistently violates the human rights of Filipinos in many different ways. This type of violence encompasses not only overt acts of physical aggression but also covert acts of political, economic, and cultural assault. So, according to WHO 2007, poverty consists of a systematic or structural denial of basic freedoms to the extent that individuals are unable or lack the capability to meet their basic needs. The denial of one's freedom implicates the denial of other freedoms, rendering the poor disproportionately vulnerable to a whole array of violations. So poverty not only means lack of money, it also means an impairment of access to adequate health care, water, shelter, and etc. So in a nutshell, structural violence is a major dilemma in a certain country for it hinders people the right to gain access to the resources they needed due to the factors such as culture, religion, community status affecting the general populace as a whole. This primarily causes a problem as the citizens do not have the equal number of opportunities needed to fully eradicate the structural violence at hand. So, in this report, we focus more on the North Korea structural violence. So, we all know that North Korea is a strict country. So, So in North Korea, structural violence is evident in the emphasis on military expenditure and nuclear capacity, which diverts resources away from essential services and perpetuates poverty and inequality among the population. In addition to that, the government of North Korea is guilty of deliberately torturing, starving, and executing its own citizens in crimes, terror, and secrecy in North Korea stated the death toll over the past few years is estimated to be about 3 million. So, the social structural violence. So, first is the poverty and inequality. So, first, let's discuss the structural violence in terms of social. So, in North Korea, they face several structural violence. First is the poverty and inequality. Second is the lack of human rights and freedom. Third is the exposure to violence and trauma. And fourth is the systematic discrimination and marginalization. Marginalization. So poverty and inequality. So most North Koreans live in poverty with millions constantly facing hunger, while government and party officials abuse their power and use bribery to maintain a better standard of living for themselves and their families. Next is the lack of human rights and freedom. So the North Koreans suppresses human rights and perpetuates a system of political oppressions with individuals classified into different groups based on their perceived loyalty. So the lack of political alternatives and the inability of citizens to contest the political system contribute to the structural violence experienced by the North Korean population. So in terms of exposure to violence and trauma, North Korean citizens, including children and adolescents, are, are exposed to various forms of violence and trauma, such as physical violence, forced labor, imprisonment, torture, and witnessing public execution. The cumulative experiences of political oppression and trauma in North Korea are linked to higher rates of family violence and mental health issues among the population compared to their South Korean counterparts. So the systematic discrimination and marginalization is that the North Korean's political classification system, which categorizes citizens into loyal, wavering, and hostile classes, perpetuates systematic discrimination and marginalization of certain groups. So individuals are further classified into 51 subcategories based on their perceived loyalty and background, leading to unequal access to resources, opportunities, and basic rights. So this means that your social standing in the community depends on the resources that you may avail. So next is the economic structure of violence. So first is a lack of rule of law and reliance on bribery. So there is no rule of law in North Korea, and the system runs on bribery with individuals having to pay bribes to access essential goods services, and even basic rights like employment, food, medical care, housing, and protection from arrest. So everything in North Korea is governed by the president. So the lack of rule of law and the prevalence of corruption contributed to the structural violence experienced by the North Korean population, as access to resources and opportunities is determined by one's wealth and connection rather than by merit or need. So only the wealthy ones are able to access the resources. So next is the diversion of resources to military expenditure. So the North Korean government's emphasis on military expenditure and nuclear capacity diverts resources away from essential services and infrastructure, perpetuating poverty, hunger, and inequality among the population. So, this prioritization of military spending over social welfare and economic development is a form of structural violence that deprives the North Korean people of access to basic needs and opportunities for economic advancement. So the North Korean focus more on the military expenditure or not the social welfare of the people. Lastly is the lack of economic opportunities and mobility. The North Korean socialist economy is unable to provide adequate employment, income, and economic opportunities for the majority of the population, leading to a reliance on the underground market economy for survival. The political classification system, which categorizes citizens into different groups based on their perceived loyalty to the regime, further limits economic opportunities and social mobility for certain segments of the population. So next is the structural violence. So the concept of sexual violence in North Korea in terms of politics is evident through the regime's political classification system, which categorizes individuals based on their perceived loyalty to the regime. This system, established by the Kim regime, classifies people into different groups including a loyal, which is the core class, a suspect, which is a wavering class, and a politically unreliable, which is the hostile class. So these political certification, discrimination, and persecution are used to maintain control over the population and suppress any dissent or opposition to the regime. The political classification system serves as a tool for social control, where loyalty to the leadership is prioritized over loyalty to the people or the socialist ideology. This system perpetuates a culture of fear, surveillance, and political oppression, limiting the individual's freedoms, opportunities, and access to resources based on their political classification. The structural violence in North Korea's political system is deeply ingrained in the country's social fabric, contributing to instability, social disorder, and the containment of dissent until people become aware of political alternatives to living under the Kim regime. Next is the religion structural violence. So the government strictly controls religious activities and any forms of religious expression outside of the officially sanctioned state church is heavily suppressed. So the North Korean constitution nominally grants freedom of religious belief, but it also prohibits the use of religion for drawing in foreign forces or for harming the state. Anyone caught practicing religion or even suspected of harboring religious views in private is subject to severe punishment, including arrest, torture, imprisonment, and execution. The North Korean government does not tolerate religious pluralism and bans independent religious activities, civil society organizations, and trade unions. The government cracks down on those accessing unsanctioned religious media or communicating with religious contacts outside the country. In fact, in 2023, the government enacted the Pyongyang Cultural Language Protection Act, in which it criminalizes communications in the puppet language, a reference to the South Korean language style, and encourage public trials and execution to awaken the masses. Next is the cultural structural violence. So the North Korea's regime's control over information, media, and cultural expression. So Pyongyang Cultural Language Protection Act. So the concept of structural violence in North Korea in terms of culture is evident through the regime's control over information, media, and cultural expression. The government strictly controls all forms of media, including phones, computers, televisions, radios, and media content, with unauthorized access considered illegal and punishable as anti-socialist behavior. The regime enforces severe penalties including torture and forced labor for accessing unsanctioned media, and it jumps Chinese mobile phone services at the border to prevent communication with the outside world. Additionally, the Pyongyang Cultural Language Protection Act criminalizes the use of language with a death penalty for violations. This cultural control and suppression of free expression contribute to a climate of fear, censorship, and ideological indoctrination, limiting cultural diversity, creativity, and individual freedoms within North Korean society. So, we will discuss the causes of the structural violence in North Korea. So, the root causes of structural violence in North Korea are complex and multifaceted, taking into account that North Korea is ruled by a dynastic dictatorship with all authority flowing from the supreme leader. This system governance has led to the concentration of power and wealth among a small elite, contributing to inequality and structural violence. Moreover, the regime maintains its power through heavy repression, including periodic purges of leadership. This climate of fear and control can contribute to a culture of violence and discrimination. On top of that, North Korea is among the world's poorest nation. Chronic food shortages and a weak economy still recovering from COVID-19 shutdowns have led to an uptick in weapons-related offenses. This economic insecurity has also led to an increased emphasis on military expenditure and nuclear capability. What makes it even more challenging on their behalf to eradicate the perpetuating structural violence is the geopolitical position of the Korean peninsula, situated between great power rivalries, has continually caused security predicaments for Koreans. So lastly, one of the main causes of North Korea's violence is the singular internal political system of the country. The above-mentioned factors, among others, contribute to the perpetuation of structural violence in North Korea. So the implications. So the severe and pervasive impact of structural violence in North Korea is manifested in widespread human rights abuses, restrictions on freedom, and economic insecurity. The government maintains control through fear, using prison camps, torture, forced labor, and threats of execution. Freedom of expression, press, and movement are heavily restricted, leading to a climate of fear and control. So despite being one of the world's poorest nations, the regime prioritizes military expenditure and nuclear capability, resulting in widespread poverty and reliance on external aid. The use of domestic forced labor, outlawing of independent trade unions, and imposition of forced labor conditions on overseas workers have significant social implications. The regime is increasing political repression, including periodic leadership purges, contributes to a culture of violence and discrimination. This underscores the urgent need for international attention and action. So, potential solutions. So, first is the international diplomacy. Next, the humanitarian aid, sanctions, and China's rule. So, when we say international diplomacy, it is a major potential initiative for change. Diplomatic dialogues with North Korean North Korea could mitigate structural violence through negotiation on nuclear disarmament, human rights, and economic reforms. So, when we say humanitarian aid can alleviate immediate suffering from food shortages and lack of basic amenities. It's crucial to ensure fair distribution of aid to avoid reinforcing existing powers power structures given the corruption in the governing body. Some sanctions. So some countries like the UK have introduced human rights sanctions against North Korean entities responsible for forced labor, torture, and murder in the country's prisons. So, China's rule. Although China prioritizing Pyongyang's stability, it recognizes the need to appease other countries like the US, South Korea, and Japan. However, China and Russia's opposition at the UN level has been a significant obstacle in implementing substantive solutions. So, these efforts highlight the importance of international cooperations in addressing the issues of structural violence in North Korea. However, the challenges lies in ensuring these efforts are effective and do not reinforce existing power structures. So that's all. Thank you.